Hello, America. I hope you're ready to rumble. This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke. I'm your humble host, Dr. Duke, a 23-year university professor, teacher, writer, scholar, I hope, and very interested cultural commentator. We're going to bring you a brand new show, Right Makes Might, which deals with conservative commentary on contemporary events, hopefully wit, wisdom, and insight. And we're going to be punching back against this behemoth of out-of-control liberalism, punching above our weight, we like to believe. So we're really excited to get started, and with that, here's Right Makes Might.
Coming to you live via recording from Appleton, Wisconsin, it's time for your Conservative Smackdown. In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
Hello and welcome to Right Makes Might. Our topic today is a timely one. As young kids all across the country return to campus for fall semester, we see the specter of liberal academia raise its head again. All across the country, liberal academics are demanding absolute free speech for themselves while simultaneously seeking to stifle what their kids can and can't say, what goes on in the classroom. That's what we're talking about today. Are you ready? Round one. Let's start with incoming assistant professor of sociology at Boston University, Saida Grundy. Professor Grundy made quite a splash a few months ago when she attacked into her Twitter account white people. She went after white men in particular with some really shocking racial generalizations, always keeping in mind that Professor Grundy's area of specialty is racial sensitivity, African American studies, trying to raise attention for the plight of minorities in this country. And how does she choose to do that? By being absolutely incendiary. Here's what she said, quote, "White masculinity isn't a problem for America's colleges. White masculinity is the problem for America's colleges." So the problem with the modern university system, according to Mrs. Grundy, is not overinflated tuition. It's not this huge ballooning student loan debt that our kids face. It's not the radical indoctrination of professors and the increasingly underprepared graduates that colleges are turning out. That's not the problem with academia. The problem with academia, college life today, is that you have white college males. They are the main problem, and we recognize this. It's this kind of race baiting, this kind of stereotyping, this kind of racial profiling. Let's call it what it is. These professors, these liberals, they condemn in the harshest terms racial profiling. To suggest that you should target at airports certain demographics or men of a certain age when trying to determine who may or may not bring a bomb on board a plane, that's racist, can't do it. Any kind of racial stereotyping is horrific to America's liberals, unless, of course, you're Saida Grundy, you're a typical American professor today, you have no problem stereotyping an entire class of white males. Right? Why is white America, she goes on to say, so reluctant to identify white college males as a problem population? Now, you just substitute the word white for absolutely any other racial, gender, sexual, ethnic classification, and this would be cause for firing. If you suggested why is black America so reluctant to identify black college males as a problem population, I would never say such a thing. But anybody who said such a thing, particularly if you're a new assistant professor who was just offered a job, I guarantee you that would be cause to withdraw the offer. The outrage on campus would be staggering. And the very people who lambaste Western culture, who attack our institutions and our history, they have no problem making the same kind of generalizations, the same kind of profiling, the same kind of stereotypical assumptions about huge groups of individuals that just happen to be a different color. And this is what passes for inconsistency and hypocrisy on college campus. Now, interestingly, initially, Boston University did not want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. This was their problem. They had hired this woman. But even after those incendiary comments, they didn't want to comment. Finally, Boston University's response came from President Robert A. Brown. And Robert Brown said, quote, "At Boston University, we acknowledge Dr. Grundy's right to hold and express her opinions. At the same time, we fully appreciate why many have reacted so strongly to her statements. Boston University does not condone racism or bigotry in any form, and we are committed to maintaining an educational environment that is free from bias, fully inclusive, and open to wide-ranging discussions. We are disappointed and concerned by statements that reduce individuals to stereotypes on the basis of a broad category such as sex. Where to begin with this? On the one hand, we should be grateful to Boston University and to its president, Mr. Brown, that the university finally had no choice but to, in the most tepid language possible, suggest that maybe Professor Grundy shouldn't have said it. But think about the hypocrisy of this statement. We think about those students at Oklahoma University, the bunch of drunken fraternity kids who made some racial commentary during a football weekend and where the entire fraternity was suspended. We think about how hard universities come down on any speech whatsoever that is perceived as anti-female or anti-minority. People get banned, they get suspended, they get expelled. Organizations on campus are defunded, they're cut off. And you have not just drunk kids now. You have a PhD-holding professor, a perfectly responsible academic, making incendiary claims like that, and this is the best Boston University can do? This is the hypocrisy. I believe, as a university professor and as an American who loves the Constitution, believes in liberty and freedom, I believe professors, like everybody else, should be free to express their opinions. I'm grateful to Professor Grundy for making those asinine statements because it lets us all know who she is. I want to know who my teachers are. But when you allow this kind of thing to go on, and you sort of tepidly condemn it, we respect her right to say what she wants. We respect her right to make incendiary comments. We just don't like it when they go too far. You would never get away with this if you were a student at that university and you made a similar statement for some other ethnic group, racial group, gender group. This is unacceptable. Where are the consequences? This is a woman who doesn't even have tenure yet. Right? And so they wind up by saying, Professor Brown, we are disappointed and concerned by statements that reduce individuals to stereotypes on the basis of a broad category such as sex. And that gets me to the least offensive thing about what Mrs. Grundy said was her attack on males. It was her attack on white males. All right, she was very racially specific, not just sex specific. This is a double whammy in terms of intolerance. It would not be allowed to stand if it was done any other way. And I'm puzzled by, I shouldn't say puzzled. I've come to expect this kind of hypocrisy. If we're going to be generally committed to free speech on campus, as this laborious explanation from Mr. Brown suggests, if we're going to do that, then we have to be tolerant equally. We have to equally apply free speech, equally accept people who misspeak and speak things that they later regret. We don't do it, and that's the problem. And that's round one. Fall. The smell of moldering leaves, the beautiful changing of the colors of leaves, that crisp feeling in the morning, that crisp air when you walk outside. What would fall be like without more insanity on our college campuses as kids return to the quad? And we pick up round two by talking about Donna Bracket, who is the director of the University of Tennessee's Pride Center, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. I would go on with all of the things that they are, but we'd be here for 20 minutes. That center. She's an associate professor and biology librarian with the University Library System in Tennessee. And Donna Bracket came out warning with a new paradigm for kids coming to campus this fall, trying to get administrators, faculty members, and most of all students to conform to her odd fixation with pronouns, remaking the English language in the nature of the Pride Center at the University of Tennessee. She said, quote, with the new semester beginning and an influx of new students on campus, notice the newness of it all, right? We've got these young kids, they're all new, let's indoctrinate them. It is important to participate in making our campus welcoming and inclusive for all. Of course, except for those who don't choose to think and speak the way she does, but we'll get to that. One way to do that is to use a student's chosen name and their correct pronouns. Quote, we should not assume someone's gender by their appearance, nor by what is listed on a roster or in student information systems. Let me stop there for a second. This administrator at the University of Tennessee is telling teachers that when they're handed an official roster by the university to begin to teach their classes the first day, that's not good enough. You can't assume from the information students enter about themselves into the computers. on their application materials. You can't assume, because a student fills out application forms and identifies with a particular gender, you also can't assume from our own University of Tennessee administrative system that the roster we give you, faculty member, is accepted. You have to assume gender doesn't exist, or gender is as malleable as hair color or what color shirt you wear that day. We should not assume someone's gender by their appearance, nor by what is listed on a roster or in a student information system. Transgender people and people who do not identify within the gender binary, male and female, may use a different name than their legal name and pronouns of their gender identity, rather than the pronouns of the sex they were assigned at birth. So, literally according to this, whatever anybody wants to be called on any given day, whatever particular pronoun or non-pronoun, or as we'll see in a moment, completely made up pronoun people want to use, professors will be on the hook if they don't. We're going to have to take attendance every single day. We're going to have a situation now where in the middle of semesters, people change their pronouns. And how long is it before we get to the point where traditional literature, going back 2,000 years, philosophy, history, all writing now is deemed offensive? And we're going to have to go back and edit these texts? It may seem like a ridiculous stretch from these comments, but we've seen in academia over the last 20 years that they're not above completely rewriting everything, completely going back and revising history to suit their goofy understanding of the world. Miss Bracket goes on to say, quote, "These may sound a little funny at first, but only because they are new. The she and he pronouns would have sounded strange too if we had been taught pronouns like je when growing up. What, you ask, is je? Well, the Pride Center at the University of Tennessee helps us. They've produced this graph. Right? Inclusive practice, pronoun usage, non-gender binary words. And so, in other words, using the word he and she are offensive. Right? The way it used to be, the way it's always been, the fact that biology seems to dictate that you have male and you have female, that, of course, is exclusive. There is no inclusion here. You're changing the way we've done things with this radically new way of looking at things that is really not based in any science. It's not based, we keep hearing that conservatives are the anti-science party, right? That conservatives don't quite we're too stupid and benighted to understand how beakers and labs work. So consequently, the left is lecturing us on how they alone understand science. Well, when it comes to things like this, the left could care less about science. This is pure and utter social engineering, and all of it's political and ideological. Take a look at the chart. Right? You've got she and he, him and her, hers and his, all like it looks, all the way it used to be. Now we get away from that radically offensive language, and we use the gender neutral because nobody can possibly be offended by gender neutral, right? Well, unless, of course, you actually believe in parameters for particular genders, particular sexes. So you've got they, them, theirs. Those are all fine because, of course, they don't bother anybody. Although, the more I think about it, Sparky, producer, take a look at the word they. Don't you have the word he in the word they? Take a look at the word them up there. Isn't the word he in the word them and theirs? Oh my goodness. I'm offended by this. Their gender neutral pronouns are gender neutral. You've got he, sitting right in the middle of those words. And my favorite on campus, Sparky, we've talked about this, is that for a long time now, the word mankind has to go. The word mankind is radically offensive. And what do we change the word mankind with? We change the word mankind for humanity. But lo and behold, Sparks, what's that in the middle of humanity there? Isn't that the word man? Ooh. And they don't like the he and she. So across campuses, all across this country, the word person now you refer to them as persons. This way you avoid these complicated and alarming gender divisions, right? And yet, what is that lurking in the middle of the word person? That would be the word son, wouldn't it? Shockingly patriarchal. We've really got to get much, much higher quality progressive radicals at the Pride Center at the University of Tennessee. And what do you replace those with, right? Words like je and jeer and jeers, right? Because who could possibly be offended? How much do you want to bet somebody somewhere is offended by them for some reason? Well, but then again, look at the word je, Mike. Look at the word jeer. Look at the word jeers. There's her in there. There's he and her in there. Well, I take it back. The word je just has he in it, but the word jeer has he and her. So I guess we can use jeer, but we got to get rid of je. Oh, the chaos of all of this. What any of this has to do with what colleges and universities should be teaching their kids? Shocking to me. But we even have a bolt of sanity, right? So the University of Tennessee, after all of this, clarifies their stance. Quote, the administration, there is no mandate. Sparky, isn't the word mandate offensive? What's the beginning of the word mandate? That bothers me. I'm troubled. There is no mandate or official policy to use the language. The information provided in our Office of Diversity, you want to know how you fix the cost of universities? That's a pretty good place to start. The information provided in our Office of Diversity and Inclusion newsletter was offered as a resource to our campus community on inclusive practices. We recognize that most people prefer to use the pronouns he and she. Isn't that wonderful? Most people are allowed. In fact, notice that I'm looking at the pronoun she. That's got the word he in it too, doesn't it? Maybe we should, in the name of true progressivism, Spark, just get rid of the word he altogether. Because when you use she, aren't you always referencing he as well? Isn't that nice? Now, of course, if you're a woman, biologically, who identifies as a man, I'm sure that would offend them, right? Because then you'd be losing the he, and women who identify as men don't want to be called she's, they want to be called he. Wouldn't that be offensive? I think it would be offensive. This statement is shocking in its own right? We do not dictate speech, the University of Tennessee says, and I appreciate that. That's wonderful. We do strive, however, to be a diverse and inclusive campus and to ensure that everyone feels welcome, accepted, and respected. What gets me about this is that you have actual professors, you have actual administrators on campus who are going out of their way to try to censor kids, to try to force kids to speak a different language than the one they grew up with, to force kids to speak a language nobody has ever spoken in the history of the world. And university administrators, presidents, advisory boards, finally, after all this stuff is allowed to hit the fan, have to step in and intervene. Just like we saw with President Robert Brown at Boston University, these apologies, these tepid statements by university administrators are not enough to guarantee freedom of kids in classrooms. And then we go, of course, to North Carolina State University, where the Women's and Gender Studies lecturing department, the Women and Gender Studies lecturer and NCSU are docking grades, threatened to dock grades for sexist language. You've got actual professors in the Women's Studies program at NCSU who are threatening kids' grades if they use sexist words like mankind, and must use the word humans or humankind, as we saw in our previous graph, our previous slide. Words like mankind have the word man in them. Words like human contain the word man. Where does this end? All right, moving forward. North Carolina State, so you've got these teachers now that are threatening kids. They're actually writing into their syllabi, their opening day materials, all sorts of threats about if you use this word or you talk that way or you're not properly sensitive, we're going to punish you for exercising your free speech. The very thing these professors are getting protected for and radically insist that, and I agree, you have the right to say these things. You've got to give that freedom to kids as well. If a kid wants to use the word he, you let him use it. You may say to him that some people won't like it, but you can't punish them for doing that, or you're hypocrites. Quote, so the North Carolina State University now had to get involved, just like the Tennessee administration did, reluctantly, and just like the Boston University did. Quote, NCSU, North Carolina State University, doesn't forbid the use of generalized pronouns. Spark, doesn't the word general offend you? It's kind of militaristic, isn't it? I mean, when you use the word generalized in a statement like this, I'm having all sorts of PTSD issues. It's traumatizing me. We've really got to work on these people. But NCSU doesn't forbid the use of generalized pronouns. But professors are allowed, isn't that nice, are allowed to set their own rules for class. So the university can suggest, hey, you shouldn't be sexist against men and you shouldn't be racist against whites. The university can suggest that, but of course, professors are free in their own classrooms to engage in that kind of nonsense if they want to. But professors are allowed to set their own rules for class. It is not standard practice to dock points from students for using purportedly sexist language in class. And I give them credit for that, right? Purportedly. Some wackadoodle professor might call it racist. Some wackadoodle professor might insist that using the words he and she are somehow offensive. But that doesn't go far enough, North Carolina State. For the reasons we saw at Boston University and Tennessee, you are enabling professors and protecting them. But you can't really protect the kids, can you? You can't really guarantee that kids aren't going to get this in their classes. And that's round two. Hypocrisy for the ages, coming at you from Washington State University. Good old Wazoo! Beat those Huskies. And with the coming of fall and the beginning of school, we get, of course, academic hypocrisy. We get the crazy lunatics that run our universities. Multiple professors at Washington State University have explicitly told their students in their syllabi and opening materials that their grades will suffer if they use such terms as illegal alien, male, and female, or if they fail to defer to non-white students. This is unbelievable. Washington State University now legislating how people react to their fellow students. Take Selena Lester Brex. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Professor of Gender Studies. Now, why are we surprised, Sparky, that yet another gender studies professor is engaging in sexist, racist, intolerant behavior? What is it with that discipline? I mean, are there no boundaries? According to the syllabus for Selena Lester Brex, quote, the title of the course is Women in Popular Culture. That's one you want to set aside a lot of money. You want to spend a lot of time, don't you, Spark, building your IRA so that one day your kid could take a class on women in popular culture, spend lots of money. That's wonderful, right? According to the syllabus for Selena Lester Brex, Women in Popular Culture class, students risk, listen to this, a failing grade if they use any language that she, in all her omnipotence, deems oppressive and hateful language. Isn't that nice? That as a professor, I ought to start doing that. Anybody who uses scare quotes in class, Sparky, I ought to fail them, right? Because that bothers me. I find that offensive. Right? Anybody who uses the term patriarchy, anybody who in class uses the term patriarchy, we're going to dock them for hateful speech. We're going to fail them because, oh my God, you're lumping 50% of the entire human population for the last 10,000 years together in that name. It is the ultimate uber stereotype. Do I get to pull that off, Spark? You think they'd let me do that on campus? Not too sure about that. Students lose 1 point every time they use the words illegal alien or illegals rather than her politically correct term, undocumented migrants, immigrants, or persons, right? So we've got a one-man language police here. We've got a woman who decides, because she gets to teach a college class, that she can authoritatively and without any consequence enforce this kind of language Nazism. And then you've got my personal favorite, Professor John Tremists, also from good old Wazoo. In fact, Washington State University, WSU. He at one time referred to Washington State University, this lefty, as white supremacist university. Isn't that wonderful? How does that's one of the joys of tenure. I get tenure, I understand it, tenure's important. But what does it do? It allows radical lefties on campus to pretty much say anything they want. John Tremists is a classical example. You've got one of the most liberal college campuses in America, which is hard to narrow that down. But at Washington State University, you can get away with doing things like John Tremists does, and yet Tremists still sees them as a bunch of Nazis. He called them Washington, a white supremacist university. He's a professor, there you go, he's a professor of ethnic studies at good old Wazoo, all right? Gender studies, we had a trend happening here, don't we? Gender studies, ethnic studies, pride groups on campus. Seems to be an awfully vocal and dominant constituency for groups that consider themselves minorities. But in any event, this professor of ethnic studies said, among other things, called them Washington White Supremacist University. Also at Washington State, white students in Professor John Tremists' Introduction to Multicultural Lit class. That's another one you want to get going on those two kids a year, Spark. Set some money aside so they can take a class like this. Introduction to Multicultural Literature class are expected to, quote, defer, unquote, to non-white students if they want to do well in this class. Let's just pause there for a second. On this man's syllabus, he tells kids, as a requirement of the class, white students must defer to the experience of non-white students if they expect to do well. The only way you're going to do well as a white student in the very white Mr. Tremists' class. Love the medallion, by the way. I bet he was something in the 70s. Would love to see the mood ring. In this guy's class, unless you defer to the experience of people of color, you risk failing the course. You understand what that means? That if you have a point that you'd like to put forward in class, and a non-white person has a point that they put forward, you can't argue, you can't debate, you can't respectfully engage each other from different perspectives. You, as the white kid, must defer. So whatever is said by a person of, and how do we define person of color? What does that mean? How do we define that? Well, I would imagine Mr. Tremists himself would decide that. I decide. Isn't it amazing that more often than not in these situations, what you have are the whitest of white people using language and speech codes and threatening failure to protect other groups, right? Who has the power here? Who are the ones doing this? In his syllabus, Tremists require students to, quote, reflect, unquote, on their grasp of history by deferring to the experiences of people of color. So in his class, the only way you are adequately understanding history, the only way you are on the right path to success in his class is if you defer to the experiences of people of color. It is absolutely astounding that you are simply on the basis of race, which haven't we learned over the last few months that race doesn't mean any. Who's this person in charge of an NAACP group? Remember that woman who was in charge of in charge of an NAACP group who turned out to be totally white? Yeah, right. And then her defenders, her liberal defenders came out and said, well, she identifies as white. It's a lot like Bruce Jenner. He identifies as a woman, so we got to call him or her. That's fine if that's the way it works. But how does it not work this way? Aren't we all people of color that way? I mean, white's a color, isn't it? I mean, different shades of white, from the pink hues of the Irish to the dusky white of the Greeks. And I mock here. Because what in the world does white male mean? Or what in the world does white people signify? Is a 2nd century BC Greek and a 19th century Norwegian and a 20th century American, these are all white males, right? They couldn't have anything less in common. Less in common. Who has less in common than a Viking, an Aristotle, and a World War I doughboy? Who has less in common than those things? And yet they're all white males, and so therefore we can treat them with impunity. This is the hypocrisy, the inconsistency, and the absurdity that comes with liberal academia today. Tremists goes on, and this gets me. This is the guy screaming for tolerance, screaming for inclusion, screaming for absolute surrender in the face of politically correct tolerance that's going to bring us a utopia that leads to a loving rainbow. You know what I notice about the rainbow, Spark? There is no white in the rainbow. That's what makes it so appealing to the left, right? You've got all the colors of the rainbow. Oddly, the white is left. You get the imagery, don't you? It's going to be the new way of justifying all this. But this denizen of higher ed, this great supporter of the rights of all, this man who's so sensitive about language, he once previously generated controversy by calling a student, quote, a white bag. Spark, I'm going to repeat that. A white bag. That's what Professor Tremists, tenured Professor Tremists, actually called a student in one of his classes. We had mentioned before, this denizen of academia also referred to Washington State University as white supremacist university. So let me ask you a question there, Spark. He's a white guy claiming that his university supports white supremacy, and yet he hasn't given up tenure in protest. He hasn't walked. Think about that. If I worked for an organization that I believed was white supremacist neo-Nazi, and my response to that was not to quit because you're paying me and can't fire me, doesn't that make me a white supremacist too? Isn't he guilty of the same thing? Quit, walk away, give up tenure, John. But no. He gets to call them white supremacists, and he gets to refer to students as, are you ready, Spark? White bags, without any consequence whatsoever. He also demands that, quote, students understand and consider the rage of people who are victims of systematic injustice. In other words, if there's a raging, angry person in class who happens to be a different color, you have to take it. If somebody in class who is considered a person of color is ranting, raving, spitting, screaming, shouting, impugning, if that's going on, as a white person, you have to show understanding of that rage, that irrationality, that anger. You have to take the insults if they're thrown your way. Because these people, well, their ancestors a few hundred years ago anyway, may have been subject to some sorts of violence or injustice. The irony of this, let me simply point out here that one of the hallmarks of the modern academic, the modern professor, the modern academic these days, is there's no sense of humor. And there is absolutely no sense of irony. We ought to go back to teaching literary terms, right? What irony means, right? What hyperbole means. And maybe they'd see just how out of line with what they preach a lot of what they preach themselves is. And that's round 3.
Do you have a question or comment you'd like Dr. Duke to respond to? Email the show at media@fpeusa.org.
Welcome to the knockout portion of our show, where we try to make a little bit of sense of this before we leave you for the day. And I want to reiterate, I believe profoundly that professors have the right to speak their minds, even if they're insensitive, even if they're foolish, even if on occasion it comes across as bigoted. Doesn't bother me. What bothers me about all of this is that the very things these professors scream, shout, protest about, the very way they defend tenure, which is a good thing, the way they defend their right to teach their classes and design their syllabuses the way they want to, I support all that. What I don't support is using that power, that untouchability, that unfireability, using that then to turn around and to take 20-year-old kids in your freshman and sophomore classes, your juniors and your seniors, and you force them to speak a brand new language. You completely change the way they write, the way they're allowed to talk. You prohibit them from engaging in certain kinds of discussions. You even go so far as to order certain kids on the basis of their race to shut up and listen if they're getting yelled at, screamed at, to prohibit them from defending themselves, from making arguments that other people might not like. This is fascism. When you use language and freedom for one group or one set of people while systematically denying it to others, you can't be in favor of inclusion. You can't be in favor of tolerance if you're shutting out voices that you don't like simply because you don't like them. Congratulations to the administrations who tepidly and half-heartedly stepped in to suggest that there should be more freedom than professors are willing to give. But if you're going to expel kids, if you're going to punish students for stepping out of line and saying things that offend people, and you're not going to do that to professors, then you're complicit as well too. And that's our knockout punch. Thanks for being with us today.
Don't miss a second of Dr. Duke. Visit FreedomProject.com and sign up for our free newsletter. Like us on Facebook or follow us in the Twitterverse. All the links can be found at FreedomProject.com.